The school rose from the hill like a promise hammered into brick, and the town came to bless it because Judge Alistair Henderson said it was meant for the poor. Mothers pressed their hands to the warm wall and told their children the building would keep them safe from the winter to come. Henderson stood at the doorway in a black coat that never gathered dust, smiling as if he had arranged a mercy. He invited the minister to say a prayer, and he waited with his hat against his chest until the last amen faded. Then he unlocked the heavy door and let the children pass one by one beneath a beam carved with a single word: discipline. He had paid masons to set the red brick with clean seams, and he had paid carpenters to line the hall with pegs for little coats, so the place would look gentle. Inside the gentleness sat the first room he called correction, a narrow box with a shuttered vent and a stool that could not tip. He said the stool taught the body to hold still so the mind could learn, but the stool taught something else. That breath was a price. In the second room hung leather straps that had been boiled in lye to make them pale and hard. He liked to hold them between his fingers like dull instruments, and he would explain to visiting ladies that the straps were for the older boys who refused their letters. He kept a ledger with tidy lines and wrote every child's name in ink that never blotted, and beside each name a mark for silence, posture, obedience. When marks fell, he sent the child to the door at the end of the hallway where the iron latch shone from use, and he turned the key with the same mild face he wore at church. Beyond the latch was the stair that led up into heat and dust, the place no child was allowed to see until the child had already entered it. He called the attic a classroom for special instruction, but he never used chalk there. He used rules. The first rule was stillness, measured by a metronome he wound with steady hands. The second was darkness, broken only when he opened the lantern shade to see if a chest still rose. The third was gratitude, required aloud before a child could drink. These rules did not rush. They moved like winter fog and settled into bone. The town did not come past the threshold because Henderson told them children learned best without interruption. He wrote letters to the newspaper about modern methods he had read of in Europe, about moral education through ordered living, about how noise filled a young mind with waste. The letters were gentle and clean, and people clipped them and kept them by the stove, proud that their little place had a man who spoke like a book. He was not a man who shouted. He preferred to wait. He had learned during the war that order wins where rage fails, and he had told himself that boys who learned order early would not break later. He never asked whether the breaking he feared was already happening in his hands. When the first week ended, he gathered the children and explained that upstairs was a room where mistakes could be undone, and he smiled when a small girl asked if the room had a window, because he liked the word window and the way it carried hope. He said there was a small one. There was, but it did not open. At dusk he sent 3 children up the stair to sit on the posture frames he had built from pine. The frames pinned the shoulders back and the chin forward with leather cups, so swallowing took effort and blinking had to be timed. He sat with his ledger on his lap and clicked the metronome, counting each held breath as a lesson earned. When one child trembled, he wrote a notation for improvement and tightened the cup by a single hole, saying softly that courage grows best where it is asked to grow. He believed that. He believed the world after the war needed clean minds the way a wound needs clean cloth. He did not believe in the body's small protest. Downstairs, the hallway smelled of soap and dried lime because he had lined the correction room with it to keep out damp, and the lime found throats and made them drink. He liked the lime because it felt like order turned into powder. In the evenings, he dismissed the children with a hymn and walked the pegs, straightening each coat so no sleeve overlapped another, and he told himself that straight lines made better days. He kept the attic key in a pocket sewn into his coat so it would not swing when he moved. He never rushed, not even when a boy coughed until his lips went blue and another child began to pray in a rusted whisper. He waited for the metronome to finish its measure, then opened the lantern shade and looked at each face with a calm that frightened them more than shouting would have. He would say the body invents storms to escape its work, and he would write a black mark beside the name of the storm. On Sundays he sat in the front pew with his hands folded high so people could see his reverence. He visited the grocer and asked after the grocer's mother and paid his bill with coins that sang. He asked the minister to bless the school, and the minister did. And that night Henderson wrote in the ledger that even God liked order. When the snow came, he lit the stove and let the chimney pull smoke into the sky so the town would see warmth and not hear the metronome. He told the children who shivered that shivering is wasted motion, and he took their coats and hung them on pegs far from their reach. He whispered that a cold body obeys faster because it has fewer ideas. He wrote that down too and underlined it. He thought he was building a clean future from small hurts that would be forgotten, but the hurts learned how to stand. And one by one they walked with the children into their sleep. The attic listened. It learned the rhythm of fear and fed it back as a hum in the boards, and sometimes the hum woke him and he rose and went upstairs and wound the metronome again because silence to him was a door that must be kept locked. In the Isa town, mothers still said the brick kept out wind. They did not see how the brick kept in something else. By the end of the first winter, the ledger at the Henderson school had gaps. Names that once sat in neat columns were struck through in a hand too steady for accident. The townspeople were told the children had been sent home, their lessons complete, their discipline restored. Henderson spoke of family reunions and grateful mothers, of boys sent to work in trades where they could earn honest wages. The words were smooth enough to settle over suspicion like a blanket. But in nearby counties, mothers waited by their gates and saw no returning figures, and letters sent to the school went unanswered. The few who came to ask in person left with the same dull-eyed quiet as though they had been shown something they could not speak of. In the classrooms, the benches thinned. The younger ones learned not to ask where their friends had gone. They had seen what came of curiosity. It began with the tap of Henderson's cane against the floor, followed by the gentle order to stand and follow. The walk to the stair was slow and calm, and the child chosen often tried to walk taller, as if good posture might earn mercy. The attic swallowed them for days, sometimes weeks. Those who returned came back changed. Eyes red, breathing shallow, shoulders hunched like their lungs ached with every swallow of air. The others never returned at all. The attic's newest chamber had been his own design, and he called it the lime room. He had read once in a manual for preserving grain that lime kept away rot by drawing moisture from the air. He liked the thought of drawing weakness from the body the same way, of cleansing a child from the inside out. The room was sealed tight, the single window nailed shut, the cracks in the boards filled with wax. The walls were coated in a slurry of caustic lime that dried into a powder soft as ash but sharp enough to burn the throat and lungs. He would place the child inside with a stool and instruct them to sit upright, not to lean against the wall. He said this was for posture, but it was because the longer they stayed still, the deeper the lime would work into the breath. At first, the air only stung, making the eyes water and the tongue taste of chalk. Hours later, the burn deepened into the chest, and each inhale came with a tearing sensation. Henderson returned at set intervals, marking the child's condition with detached precision. He took pride in noting the color change of the lips, the shift from coughs to dry gasps. It was not rage that drove him. It was a fascination with endurance. He wanted to know exactly how long it took before the body betrayed the will, before even the stubborn ones would cry for forgiveness they could not name. One boy, no more than 11, lasted longer than most. Henderson admired him in the way a collector admires a rare piece. He brought the boy water laced with vinegar, knowing it would draw more lime into the throat. When the boy finally collapsed, Henderson knelt and held his wrist, counting the slowing pulse. He did not rush. The stillness at the end mattered as much as the struggle that came before it. When the heartbeat stopped, he wrapped the body in a sheet and stored it in the far corner of the attic behind crates of unused books. The body would remain there until he decided how best to make it vanish. In the weeks that followed, more names disappeared. The surviving children learned to avoid the smallest infractions, to keep their eyes low and their hands folded in perfect stillness. But still, Henderson found reasons. A slip in posture, a hesitation in answering, a cough during a hymn. Each reason led to the stair, and the stair led to the lime room. He would watch them go, their steps small, their shoulders trembling, and feel the same quiet satisfaction that came from balancing his ledger. Outside, the town saw none of this. They saw Henderson at Sunday service, kneeling in prayer, speaking softly to the minister. They saw him visit the blacksmith and pay an exact coin, asking after his family. They saw the school's brick walls catching the afternoon sun and believed the children inside were safe. The truth remained trapped within those walls, pressed into the lungs of those who had breathed the lime until they could no longer breathe at all. When spring came, the air warmed, but the gaps in the ledger widened. Henderson explained that more students had been called home to help with the planting. No one questioned how planting could require so many small coffins carried at night to fields where no graves were marked. Those who whispered knew enough to keep their voices low. And in the attic, the lime room waited, its walls white and silent, ready for the next lesson Henderson decided needed to be taught. The children learned that survival was not a matter of learning letters or sums. It was the art of vanishing from his notice, but in a place built on his rules, notice was only ever delayed, never escaped. Henderson had come to believe that noise was a disease. He wrote this in his ledger, underlining it twice, as if the ink itself could carry the truth forward through the years. In the winter after the first disappearances, he began the next phase of his instruction. The children no longer sat in ordinary benches. Instead, he had carpenters build wooden frames to hold them upright. Straight-backed boards with curved restraints for neck and chin, padded only with thin layers of wool so the skin would not blister too quickly. Their heads were clamped in place so that even the smallest tilt was impossible. Arms rested against slats at their sides, legs fitted between narrow panels so the knees could not bend. Henderson told them that good posture opened the path to a good mind, but the truth was simpler. Stillness was submission, and submission was the only lesson worth teaching. He set a small brass bell at his table, the sound sharp and cold in the air. The children learned that one chime meant they were allowed to blink, two meant they could swallow. Until the bell sounded, they had to hold their eyes open and their breath steady. Hours passed in the thick, unmoving air. Tears ran down cheeks, not from grief, but from the burn of keeping the lids apart. Saliva pooled under tongues, turning bitter, but swallowing without permission meant punishment. Henderson watched for these mistakes the way a hunter waits for movement in the brush. He saw every flinch. He heard every breath. The slightest defiance sent a child upstairs. The attic was a place they all feared, but none had fully seen. Henderson called the punishment attic hours, as if it were just another timetable on the school's schedule. In truth, it was the quiet dismantling of the mind. The room was stripped bare with no light except what came through the thin wood slats, and even that was gone once Henderson shut the door. The darkness was total, so complete that a hand raised to the face might as well not exist. In the far corner he placed a metronome, but instead of letting it tick at steady intervals, he wound it to irregular beats. Fast, then slow, then stopping entirely before beginning again. The sound became the only measure of time, yet it betrayed any sense of rhythm. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into something for which the body had no name. At first, the children tried to count in their heads to hold on to reality, but the uneven ticking erased their sense of what was real. In that void, Henderson's voice would sometimes slip through the dark, not shouting, never kind, but speaking simple sentences that made no sense. He would tell them that the day had already passed, that they had been in the attic for a week, that the others had gone home and forgotten them. He let silence stretch between these whispers until they no longer knew which parts had been spoken aloud and which had been imagined. The mind, deprived of any anchor, began to fold in on itself. Some lasted a few hours before crying out. Henderson never answered. The sound of their own voices seemed to vanish into the walls. Others tried to hold themselves still and quiet, believing it might earn them release. But stillness was not what he wanted in the attic. He wanted unraveling. By the time the door opened again, their sense of time was gone, their bodies shivering from the strain of holding one position too long. Some emerged, unable to speak above a whisper, their voices caught somewhere between the dark and the light. A few never spoke again, their silence not a choice but a scar. 2 children did not return at all. Henderson explained to the remaining students that the pair had failed the test of obedience and been sent back to their families. No one asked which families. In truth, their bodies lay in the far corner of the attic, curled on the floor where they had collapsed. Henderson left them there for days, stepping over them to adjust the metronome for the next occupant. He told himself this was part of the lesson, that the living should sense the presence of the ones who had failed, even if they could not see them. The effect on the survivors was precise and permanent. In the classroom, no one shifted in their frames without permission. Eyes stayed wide and wet until the bell gave them mercy. The smallest sound seemed dangerous, even breathing too loudly a risk. Henderson moved through the room like a shadow given form, his cane tapping the floor in time with the metronome upstairs. He believed he was stripping away the chaos inside each child, leaving only the clean order he valued. In reality, he was grinding their sense of self into dust. One blink, one swallow, one breath at a time. By the end of that term, silence was no longer just a rule at Henderson School. It was the only language left. And in Henderson's mind, the attic was proof that he could turn even the loudest soul into something perfectly still, perfectly obedient, and perfectly his. The lesson was working, and the bodies it left behind were simply the price of progress. The attic had always been Henderson's true schoolroom, the place where the lessons were not written on slates but burned into the body. By the spring, he had turned it into something more deliberate, a stage for what he called the choir. To anyone listening from the street, the sound might have seemed holy, a slow rise of children's voices in hymns that spoke of grace and redemption. But inside the attic, the singing was no act of devotion. It was compulsion, driven by a hand that knew exactly how to keep a voice from failing without allowing the body beneath it to rest. The children stood barefoot on sheets of polished copper fixed into the floor. Wires ran from the plates to a hand-cranked generator at the far wall, a device Henderson had purchased from a traveling peddler who believed it would be used for medical therapy. Henderson understood its real value lay in control. He timed his cranking to the pitch of the hymn, sending sharp jolts through the copper whenever a note wavered. The shock was not enough to kill outright, but it was enough to draw the sound he wanted, a sudden tightening of the throat, a note bent into the range he preferred. Those who faltered too often felt the jolts more frequently, their feet twitching against the plates, their mouths stretched wider in a desperate effort to please. The hours passed without pause. There was no permission to lower the voice, no reprieve between verses. Henderson watched with the same patient attention he gave his ledger, noting who could endure and who would need further shaping. The shocks became part of the song, unseen to the ear but etched into the body's memory. Some children began to anticipate them, adjusting their pitch in tiny, frantic increments to avoid the next wave of pain. Others stopped trying, letting the current take them until their knees buckled. Those who collapsed were left where they fell. Henderson never broke the flow for the sake of a fallen singer. The hymn was more important than the life inside it. The survivors learned that stepping over a still body without breaking harmony was itself a skill he valued. As the night deepened, the air in the attic grew heavy with the smell of sweat and ozone. Voices cracked, yet the singing continued. One boy's voice dropped into a hoarse rasp, and Henderson increased the shocks until the rasp returned to a strained melody. Another child began coughing between words, but the current forced the cough into rhythm. For him, the perfect choir was not about beauty. It was about obedience under duress, the proof that even the smallest soul could be bent to a single, unbroken line of will. By the time the hymn ended, some of the children could no longer unclench their jaws. A few stood swaying, their eyes glassy from the strain. Henderson ordered them to begin again, and they did, because there was no choice left but to obey. In the far corner, a girl of 9 struggled to keep pace. Her voice had been pure when she started, high, bright, and clear. Now it was raw, the notes scraping from her throat like gravel dragged over stone. The shocks came more often, each one making her flinch, each flinch pulling her pitch lower. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, but she kept singing because stopping meant worse. Near midnight, she dropped to her knees, still mouthing the words without sound. Henderson did not move toward her. He simply adjusted the crank to deliver a last, sharp current, watching her jerk once before collapsing fully. When the singing finally ceased, the children were sent back to their frames or to the attic's dark corners to sleep on the floor. The girl lay where she had fallen. By morning, her skin was cold, her mouth open in a final silent vowel. Her vocal cords had torn under the strain of hours of forced singing and electric shock. Henderson found her at dawn, checked her pulse, and noted the absence without expression. He pulled the ledger closer, drew a line through her name, and closed the book. There was no ceremony, no announcement. To him, her death was not a tragedy, but a failed instrument, removed so the rest of the choir could remain in tune. For the surviving children, the silence that followed was worse than the song. It told them the cost of falling out of harmony, of missing a single note in Henderson's composition of pain. They stood straighter the next time the generator was wheeled out, each one praying, if prayer was still possible, that they would make it through the hymn, without becoming the next name crossed from the roll. And in Henderson's mind, the choir was not cruelty. It was refinement, proof that through enough pressure and enough pain, the human voice could be molded into something that belonged entirely to him. The girl's absence only confirmed his belief. The music would go on. The day of the inspection began like any other, with Henderson's measured walk through the hall, his cane tapping in even intervals against the polished floorboards. He had heard the knock before the sun had fully risen, the sound deliberate, official, and out of rhythm with the life of the school. The man at the door introduced himself as a state education officer, sent without notice to observe the lessons and ensure the school's compliance with the new standards. Henderson greeted him as if he had been waiting for the visit all along, his smile polite but shallow, his voice steady in a way that did not invite suspicion. He invited the officer inside, speaking warmly about the children, about their progress, about the fine moral discipline he insisted upon. His words carried the tone of a man devoted to order, to cleanliness, to the shaping of upright citizens. But in the attic above, where the air was already heavy, 4 children sat in confinement from the night before. Henderson's rules forbade them from being seen by anyone outside the school until their lessons were complete. He moved with calculated ease, leading the officer to the main hall and summoning the healthiest-looking students to sit in neat rows with their slates and primers. The display was practiced. A choir of quiet industry, every hand poised to write, every back straight. The officer noted the order approvingly, his eyes drawn to the cleanliness of the uniforms, the absence of noise. Henderson watched his gaze and made sure it never strayed toward the stair that led upward. Before the inspection began in earnest, Henderson slipped away under the guise of fetching additional records. In the attic, he worked quickly. He barred the door from the inside with 2 lengths of iron he had prepared for this very purpose. He spoke softly to the children inside, telling them this was simply another part of their instruction, that they must remain still and silent no matter what they heard. His calmness masked the fact that he knew the air was already thin, the heat already building in the sealed space. When he left, he did not look back, closing the latch and returning to the hall as if he had only gone to retrieve papers. The officer walked between the desks, speaking to the children in low tones, but these were questions rehearsed many times before. The children answered exactly as Henderson had trained them, their words formal, polite, drained of anything that might be considered complaint. Henderson stood at the front, arms folded behind his back, speaking occasionally of moral purity, of the danger of idle minds, of how structure was not cruelty but the highest form of care. He pointed out the shining floors, the precisely stacked books, the chalkboard scrubbed clean to a pale gray. Each detail was designed to reinforce his narrative of the school as a sanctuary of order in a chaotic world. Upstairs, the air thickened. The 2 youngest in the attic had begun to tremble hours earlier, their lungs laboring against the invisible weight pressing in. The older 2 tried to comfort them, but comfort in such a place was a shallow thing. Breath became something measured in sips. Their hearts beat faster as they fought to remain still, knowing any noise might bring worse. When one child collapsed, the sound of knees hitting the floor was muffled by the wooden boards. But Henderson paused mid-sentence, head tilting slightly, listening for confirmation. The officer did not notice. By the time the inspection drew to a close, 2 of the children in the attic had stopped moving entirely. Their skin had taken on the pale, waxy hue that came only when the breath had been gone for minutes. Henderson knew without checking. He walked the officer to the door, shaking his hand firmly, accepting the signed report with a gracious nod. The words written there spoke of a model institution, of discipline without cruelty, of cleanliness without sterility. The officer promised that more funding would be allocated, that Henderson's methods were exactly what the state needed in its rural schools. Henderson accepted the praise with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed himself vindicated. Only after the man had gone did Henderson return to the attic. He unbarred the door, stepping over the 2 who still breathed to kneel by the 2 who did not. His hands were steady as he closed their eyes, as if sealing a lesson into them that would now be carried no further. He did not grieve. He did not falter. In his mind, their deaths were not failures. They were proof that his system had limits, limits he would continue to push. He left the bodies where they were, knowing the sight would break what little resistance remained in the survivors. Downstairs, the children sat silent at their desks, the hum of the lesson gone cold. They knew the inspection had brought no rescue. If anything, it had brought their jailer more power, more resources to refine the precision of his cruelty. Henderson washed his hands in a basin of cold water, scrubbing each finger as if cleansing himself of the morning's work. The scent of lime clung to his skin, the same scent that clung to the walls of the attic, the same scent the children would come to associate with the thin line between life and death. In Henderson's mind, this was not murder. It was refinement. And refinement, like moral purity, demanded sacrifice. The winter came early that year. a wall of white that sealed the Henderson school from the rest of the county. The road vanished under snow, the fences disappeared in drifts, and the hill became an island no one could reach. Inside, the fires burned low and the stores of food dwindled. Henderson had foreseen shortages before, but this time, instead of tightening rations equally, he saw an opportunity to test a theory. He called it the ration trials. The children were divided into 3 groups, not by age or need, but by what he called obedience ranking, a tally he had kept in his ledger all year, recording each infraction, each hesitation, each glance he considered defiance. The highest rank would receive half portions of bread and thin soup. The middle rank would receive less, sometimes only a slice of bread or a ladle of broth. The lowest rank received nothing solid at all, only salted water poured into tin cups, its bitterness justified as a purifying draught. Henderson explained that hunger would make the disobedient grateful for what they had once taken for granted, that it would carve order into the bone. At first, the children in the lowest rank tried to endure in silence. They sipped the salted water and watched the others eat, their eyes dull but alert, as if memorizing every movement of the spoon to pretend they could taste it. Days stretched into a week and the weakness began to show. Hands trembled when they tried to write. Steps grew slower in the cold corridors. Henderson noted every sign, marking the changes with the same detachment he used to track posture or pronunciation. The middle rank soon joined them in suffering, their meager portions too small to sustain them. The upper rank looked healthier by comparison, but even they were shrinking, their faces hollowing under the skin. Henderson walked the hall each morning, his boots loud in the silence, inspecting the children as if they were specimens in a collection. He made no allowances for the cold, keeping the fires in the dormitory low, explaining that warmth without discipline led to laziness. In truth, the cold was part of the trial. It burned more calories, sped the wasting, deepened the contrast between those who endured and those who faltered. Some children tried to barter bits of bread for scraps of warmth near the stove, but Henderson stopped it, telling them that reward without rank destroyed the purpose of the test. He believed suffering must be contained and measured, not shared. By the 3rd week, the first death came quietly. A boy from the lowest rank simply failed to rise from his bed. His skin was pale, lips cracked, breath shallow until it stopped altogether. Henderson stood over the body for a long moment, then instructed 2 older students to wrap him in discarded lesson plans, pages filled with handwriting drills and moral aphorisms, before carrying him to the attic. There was no burial. The ground outside was frozen, and Henderson claimed the body must remain where the others could know it existed, though unseen. To him it was not a corpse but a tool, a warning preserved in the dark. More followed. A girl who had been healthy a month before collapsed mid-lesson, her head striking the desk with a dull sound that silenced the room. Henderson allowed her to lie there until the lesson was over, then had her wrapped in more torn pages, this time arithmetic tables, and carried upstairs. The attic filled slowly, its air colder than the rest of the school, the smell faint but growing. Henderson did not flinch from it. He believed the scent itself carried meaning, a reminder in every breath that the line between life and death was thin and entirely at his discretion. By the time the snow began to thaw at the edges of the hill, 6 children lay in the attic, their bodies stiff under their paper shrouds. The surviving students moved through the days like shadows, their eyes fixed on the floor, their voices gone flat. They no longer needed to be told where they stood in the rankings. The absence of familiar faces told them enough. The upper rank ate in silence, no longer daring to savor each bite for fear of drawing attention. The middle rank avoided the eyes of the lower, ashamed but unwilling to risk their own place. The lowest rank no longer spoke at all. When the road finally cleared and the first cart managed to reach the school, Henderson burned the lesson plans used to wrap the dead. He carried them into the yard, set them in a barrel and lit them carefully, watching the ink curl into blackened ash. But he left the bodies in the attic, telling himself they preserved discipline better than any rule or lecture could. The children knew they were still there. Every creak from above during the night was a reminder. Every draft of cold air that seeped through the ceiling carried the weight of that truth. In Henderson's mind, the ration trials had proven what he already believed. That order could be deepened through deprivation. That hunger and fear together built something stronger than comfort ever could. He told himself that the dead were not wasted. They had become part of the structure, silent pillars holding up the obedience of the living. And as the ice melted from the hill and the valley below came back to life, the Henderson school remained locked in winter, its lessons preserved in stillness, hunger, and the quiet presence of the ones who would never leave. It began with a sound out of place in the stillness, scraping above the rafters, faint but steady. Henderson knew before he climbed the stair what it was. A boy from the lower ranks, thin enough to fit between the beams, had decided to take his chances in the snow rather than face another week under Henderson's rules. The boy had pried at a seam in the roof, pulling shingles loose one by one, and now his small hands clung to the cold slate as he tried to pull himself free. Henderson's voice was calm as he stepped into the attic, the same tone he used for reciting the morning prayer, telling the boy to come down before he made things worse. But the boy hesitated. And in that pause, the old chimney flue, dry, choked with soot from weeks of low-burning fires, caught from a stray ember and began to glow. Within minutes, smoke crept into the space, slow and patient, curling along the beams as if it knew it had time. Henderson did not run for water. He did not call for help. Instead, he moved through the lower hall and gathered the others, 22 children in all, ordering them to the attic in a voice that brooked no delay. They went because there was no other choice, because disobedience had always led to worse than anything they could imagine upstairs. He told them they must pray until the danger passed, that God rewarded those who faced trials without fear. The door closed behind them with the solid weight of the iron latch, and the key turned once in his hand. The smoke thickened slowly at first, the air turning heavy and acrid. The children knelt in rows as they had been taught, hands clasped, heads bowed. Some whispered the words they remembered from the hymns. Others stayed silent, their eyes fixed on the door. The heat rose in small increments, pressing against their skin, making their clothes stick to their backs. Henderson had chosen his moment well. The fire in the flue was controlled enough not to consume the structure. But the chimney's slow burn filled the attic with a steady stream of carbon-laced air. He knew the body could endure smoke for a time, but combined with the heat, it would begin to unravel willpower, thought, breath. Minutes became an hour. The first coughs began sharp and sudden, breaking the forced stillness. Henderson, standing below with the metronome ticking beside him, listened as the coughing spread, turning into shallow gasps. He imagined the panic rising as the air grew thinner, as every breath became an effort and every exhale brought no relief. A few children pressed themselves against the floorboards, trying to find cooler air near the cracks. But even there the heat was building, seeping upward from the walls themselves. Sweat ran into their eyes, stung their lips, blurred their vision. The prayers faltered, replaced by quiet whimpers, and then by nothing at all. As the second hour passed, the air in the attic became a weight no one could push aside. The younger ones went first, slumping forward into the laps of the older children, their faces pale and wet. The older ones lasted longer, some out of stubbornness, some out of fear, but one by one they sank to the floor. The heat stroke took them in stages, first confusion, then stillness, then the final limpness that meant the body had decided to stop fighting. Henderson knew the signs without seeing them. He had studied how deprivation and exposure worked on the body. He understood the pace of dying when no wound was visible. By the time the last movement ceased, the chimney's burn had quieted, the smoke thinning into a faint haze. Henderson did not rush to open the door. He let the silence settle, let it become something the walls would remember. When he finally stepped inside, the sight was orderly in its own way. The children lay as if in a final lesson, their positions echoing the neat rows he had drilled into them. Hands still clasped for some, others with fingers curled against the boards. He walked among them without touching, noting how the heat had left their skin flushed rather than pale. The marks of the smoke hidden deep in the lungs. He descended the stair and returned to his desk, his ledger waiting open. The page for that day was blank except for the date. He wrote in a careful hand, "Lesson complete," then drew a thin line under the words. There was no mention of the fire, no list of names. To him, the event was not tragedy but fulfillment, proof that discipline could hold even to the final breath, that obedience, once rooted deep enough, could survive until life itself ended. Upstairs, the air cooled slowly over the bodies and the heat in the boards faded to nothing. Outside, the snow fell in soft, soundless sheets covering the roof, sealing in the quiet. Inside Henderson's mind, the fire was not an accident. It was a purification, a cleansing of the ranks, and it had burned away the last resistance he had ever sensed among them. The next morning, when the surviving children from the lower dormitory filed into the hall, they did so without a sound, without a glance at the stair. The attic was no longer just a place of punishment. It was a place of ending. And Henderson, with his ledger closed and his hands folded, was content to let it stand as such. The thaw came slow that year, the snow bleeding into the earth in thin rivulets, leaving behind the smell of damp soil and rot. The Henderson school stood unchanged on its hill, its red brick walls catching the pale spring sun. The townspeople had not seen Henderson for weeks, though a thin column of smoke had sometimes drifted from the chimney, a sign that life, or something like it, remained inside. It was a former teacher, Mrs. Claire Whitlow, who finally returned, hoping to collect a few personal belongings she had left when she resigned before the deep winter set in. She told herself it was a brief errand, nothing more than reclaiming her coat and books, but as soon as she stepped into the main hall, the air told her otherwise. It was not the sharp, dry scent of lime Henderson used to scrub the walls, nor the faint smoke that clung to old wood. This was heavier, sweet at the edges, cloying with a depth that seemed to sink into her lungs. She followed it without meaning to, drawn by an unease she could not ignore. The scent thickened near the stair that led to the attic, and though she had never been allowed beyond its door when she worked there, she found herself climbing. The latch was locked from the outside, the key gone, but something about the silence behind it felt wrong. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of something sealed away. She fetched a crowbar from the tool shed and returned with her hands shaking. It took 3 hard strikes before the lock gave way, the door swinging inward with a groan. The smell hit her in full then, the unmistakable truth of what the winter had hidden. The light from the narrow attic window cut across the room, revealing the figures, 22 of them, seated in neat, perfect rows. Their hands were folded in their laps, their heads tilted slightly forward as if still waiting for a lesson to begin. Their skin had tightened and split in places, the cold preserving what the heat had not destroyed. In some spots, the floor beneath them bore dark stains, the wood warped where bodies had lain too long in one place. A few were fused to the boards entirely, the remains of their legs bound by the melted skin and fabric of their clothing. Mrs. Whitlow could not bring herself to cross the threshold. She stood frozen, her mind caught between the orderly arrangement before her and the horror of what it meant. This was no chaotic death. There had been no struggle, no collapse into disarray. Henderson had made them sit like this. He had locked them here to die in postures of obedience, turning their final moments into an extension of his lessons. She saw small details that turned her stomach further, a ribbon still tied neatly in a girl's hair, a slate propped against a wall with the last faint trace of a chalk line, a hymn book resting on the knees of one who would never sing again. She forced herself to step inside, her shoes sticking slightly where the floor had absorbed the dead. The air was thick with the residue of smoke and the stale scent of bodies too long confined. In the far corner, on a desk cleared of dust, lay Henderson's ledger, its pages unmarked since the winter. Next to it, a set of brass keys glinted in the dim light. Each key was engraved with a verse, the letters cut deep into the metal. Spare not the rod, be still and know, the wages of sin is death. They were arranged in a perfect row, their cold shine a mockery of the warm lives they had helped to end. Henderson himself was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no papers scattered in haste. He had left as carefully as he had lived, taking nothing but his own presence with him. Mrs. Whitlow felt the weight of his absence as much as the weight of the room. This had been his final lesson, his last proof of control. And now he had walked away, leaving the evidence behind like a monument. Outside, the thaw continued, the hill shedding the last of its snow. The town below would soon smell what Mrs. Whitlow smelled now. The wind carrying it down into the streets. She imagined the questions that would follow, the officials who would come, the way they would try to fit this into words fit for a report. But there was no way to capture the precision of it, the deliberate shaping of death into something that looked like discipline. The children had not died in panic or rebellion. They had died in the poses he had given them, each one a quiet echo of the authority that had ruled their days. She left the keys where they were, took the ledger in both hands and carried it downstairs. It was heavier than she expected, as if the ink itself bore the weight of what had been done. Henderson's handwriting was as calm and orderly as ever, even in the last entries, his loops and lines betraying no haste. There were no names on the final pages, only numbers and short notations, times, temperatures, intervals, measurements of suffering reduced to data. It was the work of a man who had never once seen himself as cruel, only as exact. When she stepped outside, the fresh air felt thin and sharp, but it carried no comfort. Behind her in the attic, the lesson remained. The rows would hold their positions until someone came to take them down, until the boards were pried up and the room was cleared. But even then, the shape of them would linger. And somewhere Henderson would be moving on to another place, another set of walls carrying his brass keys and his belief that order was worth any price, even this. They found Henderson in Savannah 3 weeks after the bodies were discovered. He was not hiding in some dark room or fleeing under cover of night. He was walking openly along the harbor, coat buttoned against the sea wind, stopping to shake hands with men in gray coats who still wore their Confederate service pins. His manner was calm, his eyes untroubled, as if the events in the attic had been nothing more than a difficult winter best left unspoken. The men who greeted him were not strangers. They were former officers, judges, merchants whose fortunes had been tied to the old order, and who saw in Henderson a man who understood how to keep the unruly in line. They had no interest in the stories being whispered up north, no patience for tales of cruelty that could weaken the image of Southern discipline. When word reached the county where the school had stood, there was hope among a few that the law would finally close its hand around him. A teacher's sworn account, the smell of the attic, the rows of bodies, these should have been enough. But Savannah was not a place where such evidence outweighed loyalty, especially in the years after the war. Henderson had aligned himself carefully with the right men, the right pulpits, the right causes. The clergy spoke of him as a man of rare moral conviction, a teacher who had tried to instill order in a generation softened by defeat. From the pulpits came talk of how the tragedy was an unfortunate accident, the result of a fire and the chaos of frightened children. No one repeated the parts about locked doors, about weeks of hunger, about discipline taken beyond the bounds of life itself. Witnesses who might have spoken were quietly visited. Some were offered coin, others were reminded of debts of family members still working on land owned by men close to Henderson's circle. Those who persisted were told plainly that no court in the state would believe them over a decorated veteran and the testimony of his friends in the cloth. The deaths were reshaped in official language. Smoke inhalation became the cause, tragic misfortune the classification. The coroner's report was signed without hesitation. A neat page that erased months of methodical cruelty with a single sentence. In this Savannah of polished words and closed ranks, Henderson was not a fugitive. He was a guest of honor at private dinners, a quiet voice at council meetings where the future of education in the region was discussed. He spoke of moral purity, of the dangers of leniency, of how the war had left too many young people without structure. Men nodded along, some remembering their own days of rigid drilling in camps and seeing nothing amiss in his methods. That some of those children had died was regrettable, yes, but in their eyes regrettable did not mean unforgivable. The politics of the day gave him more cover still. Reconstruction was unraveling, federal attention shifting away from the Deep South, and the old networks of power were knitting themselves back together. In that climate, men like Henderson were valuable, not liabilities but assets, able to enforce the kind of order that kept the fragile balance from tipping. Race and class sat at the center of it. The families who had lost children were poor, some black, some white tenant farmers, none with the standing to challenge the men who now shielded him. Their grief was invisible in the official record, their testimony reduced to footnotes in reports that would never see a courtroom. In the weeks that followed, Henderson's name faded from the northern newspapers. The story of the attic deaths was replaced by other tragedies, other headlines. Locally, it was spoken of less and less until only in quiet kitchens did the truth slip out in whispers. Henderson himself seemed to grow stronger in absence of consequence. He began drafting letters to contacts in other counties, speaking of new opportunities, new institutions that could benefit from his approach. In his mind, the winter at the Henderson school had proven the strength of his methods, not their danger. The deaths were not a stain. They were the inevitable price of shaping a generation that would obey without question. By the time spring turned to summer, the chance for justice was gone. No trial was ever scheduled, no charges filed. The death certificates were signed, sealed, and filed away in the courthouse basement. The brass keys engraved with biblical verses were never recovered. Some said he carried them still, turning them in his pocket as he spoke of discipline and purity. And in the towns where his name still carried weight, mothers kept their children close when strangers passed. Not because they feared the lawless, but because they feared the men who walked inside it, untouchable. The trial that never came was more than a failure of law. It was a warning. It showed that in the right light, evil could pass as virtue, and the hand that locked a door could be the same one raised in blessing. Henderson had proven that with the right allies, with the right words, a man could leave 22 dead in an attic and walk away untouched, carrying not guilt, but the quiet confidence of someone who had simply completed his work. When the Henderson School was finally torn down in 1902, there was no ceremony, no gathering of townspeople to watch the brick crumble. The workmen took it apart methodically, stone by stone, and carted the remains away as if dismantling an old shed. There was no effort to preserve the building or its contents. The past it held was something the town had long agreed, without saying aloud, to bury under silence. When the last wall fell, the only thing left was a patch of bare ground and a plaque bolted to a wooden post. It bore no names, no explanation, no mention of the 22 who had died in the attic. It simply read, "Here stood Henderson School, 1868 to 1871. To the few still alive who remembered the winter of the fire, the words felt like a deliberate erasure, but no one challenged it. They had learned the cost of speaking too plainly about what had happened there. For decades, the site was avoided. Children were told not to play there, though the reason was never given directly. Some said the soil was bad. that nothing would grow where the school had stood, and in time the empty patch became a place people walked around without thinking. The silence held, passed down through generations not as a story but as an absence. Henderson's name was rarely spoken, and when it was softened. He became the headmaster, or that schoolman, as if distance in words could soften the shape of what he had done. The survivors who had made it out lived quietly, carrying the memory like a splinter under the skin. They built their lives away from the hill, but the smell of smoke, the creak of wood in summer heat, the sight of neatly folded hands could still make them pause and swallow hard. It was not until the 1970s that the silence cracked. A young historian named Daniel Croft, working on a project about Reconstruction-era education, came across a mention of the school in an old county ledger. Curious, he searched the archives, finding almost nothing. No detailed records, no trial transcripts, only the coroner's brief report and a photograph of the plaque on the empty hill. But in the back of a locked cabinet in the courthouse basement, he found Henderson's ledger. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but legible. Croft opened it expecting enrollment lists and lesson plans. Instead, he found the meticulous accounting of discipline, dates, names, durations of confinement, notes on posture, breathing, obedience. In the margins were strange phrases: lesson complete, purity restored, failed the trial, and beside certain names a single black mark. As he read, Croft began to understand that the ledger was not simply a record of schooling, but a record of control, of experiments in suffering carried out with the same cold precision one might use to measure rainfall. There were no emotional entries, no moments of hesitation. Only the clean hand of a man who believed in the necessity of what he was doing. In the back pages, the handwriting grew even more concise, reducing the children to numbers and intervals, stripping them of identity entirely. Croft sought out the living survivors, though there were few by then. The oldest was in her late 90s, her voice thin but steady. She told him about the attic, about the copper plates and the shocks, about the days without food, about the winter when the smoke came through the floorboards. She spoke without tears. But when she described the moment the door was locked for the last time, her hands gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles whitened. Another survivor, younger when she escaped, refused to speak on the record but told him quietly that the hardest part had not been the pain but the way Henderson could make the others watch and stay silent. The survivors agreed on one thing. The deaths had not been accidents. They had been the final step in a method Henderson had been refining from the start. The historian's report, when it was published, stirred brief interest but no formal response from the county. The plaque remained untouched, its sparse inscription now seeming even more deliberate in its omission. Croft pushed for a memorial that named the victims, but the idea was met with polite deflection. Too much time had passed, people said. The truth would only reopen wounds. In the final pages of his work, Croft reflected on the strange durability of Henderson's image in the local memory. Though the stories from the survivors were clear, the public record had allowed him to remain for decades a man of charity, a veteran, an educator. His cruelty had been sanctified by the very institution meant to hold him accountable. The school had been built in the name of learning and moral purity, and so even its worst acts had been shielded under those same ideals. The hill remains empty. Grass grows over the place where the attic once stood, and the plaque still leans against its post. On quiet days, it is just another patch of land. But those who know the ledger, who have read the testimonies, see it differently. They see the rows of children sitting in stillness, the locked door, the heat and the smoke and the silence that followed. They see how easily it was all hidden, how quickly a community can decide that remembering is more dangerous than forgetting. And they are left with the question Croft chose to end his report with, the same question that hangs in the air for anyone who visits that hill. What do you think? Could this happen again?